And to ensure a smooth and focused session, everyone will be muted throughout the presentation to avoid disruptions. If any participant becomes disruptive during the event, they will be immediately removed from the webinar and we won't be able to rejoin. Additionally, in the unlikely event of a Zoom bombing incident, the meeting will be terminated promptly to protect our discussion. Now, as we begin, I'd like to kindly ask you to take a moment to rename yourself to include your first and last name, if possible, what town or organization you're representing. And to do this, you can just click on the participants bottom button on the bottom of your Zoom screen to locate your name in the participants list. And then you just click more and then select rename. You can see that on the screen right here. And to engage with us during the session, please use the chat feature to submit questions that you may have throughout the talk or at the end. And we'll do our best to address your questions at the end of the presentation with the understanding we might not get to all of them. And I'd like to also show you how to change your view settings so that the speaker or speakers are spotlighted, and this way you can have a better view of the content. So you can do this by clicking on the view option, which is sort of that orange block that you see on the screen in the top right corner, and selecting speaker view from the drop-down menu. And if at any point anyone experiences any technical issues during our session, please don't hesitate to reach out to our tech support staff, Abby. Abby is here to assist you and ensure a smooth experience for everyone. And before we move forward, I'd like to take a moment to give a bit of a background on our Rooted in Nature series. Spanning 5 thematic sessions, we have gathered experts from Indigenous communities right here in Massachusetts to offer an exploration of Indigenous perspectives on climate resilience and sustainability. The series supports the implementation of Metro Common 2050, our regional land use plan, particularly our strategies to advance climate mitigation and resiliency and inclusive growth and development. It also aligns with the broader shift in climate resiliency landscape, recognizing and uplifting Indigenous knowledge as the vital resource. An example of this shift is the recent formation of the Center for Braiding Indigenous Knowledge and Science at UMass Amherst, led by Dr. Sonia Adelaide. The series by MAPC mirrors this progressive approach, aiming to enhance climate adaptation strategies by fostering a deeper understanding of Indigenous cultures and encouraging collaborations for cross-municipality projects that are geared to address the impacts of climate change collectively. Now, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Sasha Brody, who will share a quick message about how this series and today's topic fit into the broader work at MAPC.
Thank you, Lindsay, and hello, everyone. My name is Sasha Brody, and I work on the community engagement team at MAPC, and I'm so excited to be kicking off the series with you all today. As planners and public servants, I believe that we often live in the dreams of our future. Sometimes those dreams may involve wonky conversations about zoning or policy or intricate mapping details that we're going over at a public meeting. But dreams they are nonetheless, because at our core, we're asking, what do we need for people to live well? And how do we thrive in our future together? I fundamentally believe that in order to answer those questions and get to that future, we have to understand our past. At MAPC, we have been working over the last few years to better understand the impact of historic planning practices on the continued erasure and harm towards Indigenous communities in the region. Our hope is that in fostering better understanding of Indigenous cultures and practices, we can also start finding pathways for repair, trust building, and hopefully can grow that into reciprocal collaboration. This series is one of our learning opportunities and learning that we are hoping to do together with you. We know that to address the problems of the current world we are facing, we need dynamic solutions and we need everyone's perspective. Indigenous communities have long been stewards of climate, and the knowledge that will be shared through this series is not only a gift, but a reflection of centuries of continued practice that we can learn from and build with. I encourage you to come into this session and series with curiosity. I hope you ask questions, but also I hope that you bring willingness to listen, understand, and take in information that may be new to you. Thanks for taking the time to be here today, and to the speakers who have generously offered their knowledge, skills, and time. I hope that this is the start of many conversations that move us towards a future we can dream up and realize together. And I'm really excited for the journey that we're about to embark on.
Thank you, Sasha. We appreciate your perspective, and it underscores the significance of today's session in the context of our expanding efforts here at MAPC. So let's move forward with the program and introduce our main speaker, the reason everyone is here today. We are welcoming Ryann Monteiro. She is an educator, public health practitioner, and Indigenous health advocate who is a citizen of the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead, Aquinnah. Being raised with her Cape Verdean mother's religion and her Wampanoag father's culture, she learned to navigate distinct worlds made up of their own cultures, values, and worldviews from a young age. With this upbringing, she honors and acknowledges that these various worldviews serve as a foundation of how cultures define and respond to health and well-being. Ryann describes the three pillars that drive her work as community, culture, and connection, and believes that the foundation for a thriving community is one that values relationships and responsibility to the land and each other. She aims to add value by creating and holding space for historically marginalized communities to be active participants in the health system by voicing and advocating for community-specific needs and values. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ryann, and we're eager to hear her perspective on today's topic. So Ryann, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to screen share. Hopefully this goes very smoothly. See. Okay. Is this going to work? Okay, this is not going smoothly. All right. Almost there. I was just telling the team that I just did this dual monitor setup and still trying to figure it out. But hopefully you can see my slides now. Awesome. Great. So welcome everybody. Super excited to be here today. The title of my talk is For Our Mother, For Our Children, Introduction to Indigenous Worldviews on Climate Resilience. You heard a little bit about me, but today, so we'll jump right in, but I will add some more context. So today's objective is for really all of you to gain a foundational understanding of Indigenous worldviews and its relationship to climate health, how climate change affects Indigenous nations, peoples, and communities, and what you or your organization or your department can do. So something that I start off with every talk, I think it's really important that you know who is speaking to you and from what context. So on the left-hand side of this world, the upper left, is a picture of a cranberry bog. I grew up in Rochester, Massachusetts, which is a little bit closer to the Cape. If you're out of state or not from New England, if you've ever had Ocean Spray cranberry juice or have seen a commercial, I grew up where they filmed those. So that's a little fun fact. On the bottom left is a picture of the Aquinnah Cliffs, which is my ancestral home on my father's side. And then on this right-hand side, there's a picture of a Cape Verdean flag. Cape Verde is a series of islands off the west coast of Africa. My mother is fully Cape Verdean. The Wampanoag ancestral line comes from my father. And here is in the middle a picture of my great grandmother, Anna Martin, with her uncle, Lorenzo Jeffers. Hopefully you can see that. So how I would introduce myself traditionally is Natasawis. I would say Natasawis, Ryann, Wampanoag, Natomas, Aquinnah, Wana, Cape Verde, Wananatai, Chicago. So I say I am called Ryann, I'm Wampanoag, but my blood and my DNA is specifically from Aquinnah, and I currently live in Chicago. The thing about community is how you are called, Natasawis, is always dependent on your relationship to that community. So you could call me Ryan. Oh, goodness gracious. Okay. Oh no. Okay. This is new. 1 second. That is terrible timing for that. But in community, I would be called Jane and Bear's daughter, Billy's granddaughter, Anna's great-granddaughter. And you kind of trace your line through your maternal bloodline. So Wampanoag people are, we are matrilineal. So it always goes through your mother, but your father, my father, is the one who carries the line. Let me see if I can get this shared screen situation back up and running. Can you see that? Okay.
Yes, but I can see it's more your desktop.
Oh, this is not going smoothly. All right. I logged in early to troubleshoot these things for the record. Let's try this one more time. Okay. We are almost back in action. This is fabulous. So that's a little bit about how I would introduce myself, or how folks would know me in the community. So what I wanted to start off with today is kind of this big question of who or what is the earth to us. And I want to start with this question because throughout this webinar series, you're going to hear and learn from amazing Indigenous women with very specific themes that go more into depth than what we're here to do today. And so my job is to prime you for those sessions and connect some of the dots in advance so you can truly absorb what's being shared within some cultural context. Oftentimes Indigenous people have to explain a lot of things to people. And so my purpose today is to prime you in order to take some of that emotional labor from the speakers so they can focus on their content area, and then you can fully absorb in the conversation and the information that's being shared. And I say that to say this is a safe space where you can ask freely. And I always say this is the place where you can ask all the questions you've tried to Google but couldn't find the answer to. Like any good public health practitioner, I will state my limitations. So I just want to be super clear that I'm speaking today as a tribal citizen in my experience as a Wampanoag woman, but I can't answer. I'm not a tribal government representative, so I can't speak, or I do not wish to speak for all Wampanoag people or my specific tribal government, but I'm just here to provide some context and kind of walk you through some of the worldviews and perspectives that are going to come up in later sessions. So full disclosure, people always get very uptight when we talk about religion. If this was a semester course, we'd probably wait until week 4, but we will go into this in the first 4 minutes. So power and place perspectives are often formed by religious beliefs. And I'm starting here because the question of who or what the earth is to us is kind of rooted in our inherent beliefs. And our inherent beliefs are usually based in religion or spiritual beliefs. So religious teachings provide moral guidelines for followers. Religions establish humans' existence in relation to the rest of the living world. They have a remarkable impact upon standards of behavioral decisions because followers adapt behaviors according to social expectations of religious institutions. Religious teachings, they guide us with ethics and values, and then learned values are demonstrated in personal behaviors, public behaviors, and policy determinations. And because we're focusing on tribal communities in North America, this does lean more towards Christianity. So as we kind of go through more dominant worldviews and how this relates to climate health, you're going to see how some of these themes come up and how they relate to each other. So there are a few different environmental value orientations of human societies that can be categorized into 3 ways. We have 2 pictures of what that can look like, but there's a third that we're going to talk about. So these value orientations can be described as dominion over nature, harmony with nature, or submission to nature. And dominion over nature, that belief is introduced in the Judeo-Christian creation story, which told that human beings were created in God's image and closer to the creator than the rest of creation. And this argument is based on the book of Genesis and the placement of nature and animal beings under human dominion. And so this is also called anthropocentrism, which places the primary value of nature in service to humans. Something that is a little bit closer, but it's not entirely accurate, would be this image on the left, which is biocentrism, which is more with the, I would say it's a little bit more of like the submission to nature. It's like we are just a part of this ecosystem. But then the third, that there's not really a good diagram for this, is kin-centric relationships, which is more so of, it's based on the belief that nothing is really higher or below, nothing is higher or lower than us. And it's based in responsibility and respect. So although religion or spirituality differs between tribes and nations, traditional tribal values contain intrinsic themes of ecological interconnectedness that guide reciprocal relationships with the natural world. So there's this commonality of reverence and honor for the earth, and lands and places are held in the highest spiritual meaning. So going back to that question of like, what or who the earth means to you, like what's your relationship to that? If your beliefs are more so in alignment with the right, you are naturally going to treat the earth and nature as it's always in service to you. What can I extract from it? What can I get from it? Whereas the indigenous standpoint is more so of like, this takes care of me and I take care of it. And this also ties back to creation stories. So we just talked about a little bit about how this comes from the book of Genesis, this like dominion over nature. We can see how this line of thought connects. But in a lot of traditional cultures, indigenous cultures, every nation or community has their own creation story, and it usually is centered around the earth being the mother. And so I think that the term like Mother Earth has become this like very like woo-woo hippie type of thing. But for us, it's like the displacement of indigenous peoples is not just taking away people from the land that they were stewarding. It's literally the equivalent of taking a child away from its mother. And so how this relates to climate health is we are asking, or we are always advocating for, like, let us reconnect with our mother because we know her. Nobody knows a mother like the child, and nobody knows their child like the mother. And so that's the depth in which this goes in. And so when we talk about indigenous perspectives on climate health and resilience and how we respond to it, that is the mindset that is happening. And then we filter in all of the other kind of nuances and barriers, such as policies and legalities and territories. And it gets really complicated. So this is not something that we can address in an hour, but I just want to make sure that you're at least walking away with some foundation of, okay, this is the mindset, the general mindset of communities. So when you're having conversations, you can better understand where Indigenous peoples or governments are coming from. I know this is very text heavy and we're not going to go through all of this, but difference in worldviews. So in the left, we have common dominant worldview manifestations, and common indigenous worldview manifestations. And this chart is by Four Arrows, also known as Don Trent Jacobs. And so I wanted to source this here because I felt like it really outlines kind of how things can be dichotomous in a way. So he lists 40 of them, but what I wanted to go through was more so of like the things that stand out to me when I'm talking or teaching people about difference in worldviews. So there's 40 of these. We're not going to go through all of them, but just some of the ones that I've highlighted. So common dominant worldview manifestations focus on self and personal gain when we start talking about capitalism, things of that sort. Anthropocentric, being human-centered, things are in service to me. Words used to deceive self or others. We talk about all the time how treaties are broken, how the sacredness of someone's word and keeping your word has been lost in kind of just like Western society. Truth claims as absolutes, unfamiliarity with alternative consciousness or disbelief in spiritual energies. And in relation, or in contrast, some common indigenous worldview manifestations are things that are not hierarchical. Like I said, there's not really much above or below, but there is reverence. Emphasis on community welfare, strong emphasis on empathy, humility, and gratitude. A common kind of saying or just daily practice of indigenous people is, a common saying I always say is, only take what you need, use all that you take, and always give thanks. There's always some offering. There's always a recognition of like, this is a gift to me, and I'm acknowledging the gift that you have chosen to share. In indigenous cultures, and a lot of indigenous cultures, it's very animistic. So kind of in Western society, it's like the only beings that have feelings or a sphere are human beings. But in traditional indigenous perspectives, all we have are human relatives, our non-human relatives, our spiritual relatives, and they all have something to offer. And how we speak and communicate and relate to them comes through ceremony, song, dance, offerings, things of that sort. So I just wanted to highlight some of those. Again, common denominant worldviews, minimal contact with others, time is linear, emphasis on rights versus the inseparability of knowledge and action. Time is like non-linear, emphasis on responsibility, and ceremony as life-sustaining, not just a ritual that is separated into otherness. Other ones that, and hopefully you'll start to see kind of how religion is a root of some of these manifestations, which makes sense. Human nature as corrupt or evil, humor used infrequently for coping, social laws of society are primary, nature as a dangerous thing or it's utilitarian only, versus humor as an essential tool for coping. Learning is holistic and place-based. We're going to talk more about place-based next. Laws of nature are primary and autonomy is sought to serve others versus being sought to serve the self. I put an asterisk over here on 30, humor as an essential tool for coping. So I'm a food scholar. Food is more of my my thing, and a really great book that talks about how Indigenous people and specifically New England use humor as a coping mechanism during times of low food source is called Violent Appetites. That's a really great book if anybody is interested in kind of contact period colonial food perspective stuff. Okay, So now that we've talked about that a little bit, so there is a growing recognition that Indigenous perspectives should be front and center in climate change responses, but there's not really a conversation about why, and there's a few reasons why this is happening. So one is place-based knowledge, which is extremely important, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this context soon. So just a thought, a quote that I thought was really great by Valerie Segrest is, "The land is our identity and holds for us all the answers we need to be healthy, vibrant, and a thriving community. In our oral traditions, our creation story, we are taught that the land that provides the foods and medicines we need are a part of who we are. Without the elk, salmon, huckleberries, shellfish, and cedar trees, we are nobody. This is our medicine, remembering who we are and the lands that we come from." So when I introduced myself earlier, I said Newtomas, which means like it literally translates to like my blood and my DNA is from this place. Like this is you can't separate it from me. Versus Natai, which means like this is where I currently am. So you're always telling people like where the land that I come from and then where I'm currently residing, because you just can't separate yourself from home. It's just inherent and it's a oneness that is very special and a high priority for us. And then just another, I think, really great example of settler versus indigenous perspectives on land, which is very illuminating to me, is there's this quote by Reverend Samuel Stoddard of Boston in 1722, who justifies the colonists' acquisition of Indian land for little to no payment, as the Indians made no use of it but for hunting. And then another reverend of Rhode Island explains that by driving out and killing the Indians as punishment for their sins, God was pleased to make ready for a place prepared as an asylum. And he's talking to in reference to New England settlers. So again, we're seeing this, like, here are our foundational beliefs, here are the manifestations abstractly, and then we're seeing it actually, like how it justifies action. And so why Indigenous perspectives are now being recognized important and as should be centered, it's because it's finally being recognized that, like, hey, these communities have been stewards of this land for a very long time. In very scientific terms, a very long observational study. Anybody who's even lived in a home or community for 20 years, if I asked you and you've lived in Medford, let's say, for 20 years, you'd be able to tell me how much that place has changed, whether it's population wise, environment. You'd be able to tell me about the bakery that burnt down in the 70s. You'd be able to tell me about how the town was in an uproar when a new development came in. So on and so forth, because you know that place. And so for some reason, people, it gets lost in translation what that means when you've been in a place for 200 years, for 2,000 years, for 10,000 years. And it's hard to conceptualize 2,000 years or 10,000 years, and not that Indigenous knowledge needs to be validated. But then you have disciplines like anthropology that are like, oh no, there's literal evidence and proof that these people have been here since X amount of time. And so now it's kind of like society is catching up to speed, that like, hey, they know something that we don't, or that we've ignored or we've chosen to ignore. And a lot of times that knowledge is either exiled or marginalized for political agendas, for economic agendas, things of that sort. So in contrast, Indigenous worldview on land, I love this quote by Chief Luther Standing Bear, And he says, miles to us were as they were to the bird. The land was ours to roam as the sky was theirs to fly in. We did not think of the great open plains, the beautiful rolling hills and winding streams with tangled growth as wild. Only to a white man was nature wilderness, and only to him was the land infested with wild animals and savage people. So this friction between how we view the land, we just saw it in the previous quote, land as a commodity, land as something to be owned, to purchased, to be extracted from, versus like, I'm an extension of the land, I'm a manifestation of the land, and therefore I cannot be separated from it. So that worldview leads us to like, we are a reflection of the health of our surroundings and our landscape. And that's why stewardship and responsibility and reciprocity are kind of pillars of Indigenous culture. I also think it's very important to remind folks and just explicitly state that like context very much matters. So just as Indigenous people are not a monolithic group, neither are their worldviews, neither are their creation stories, ceremonies, cultures, so on and so forth. And that has a few underlying reasons. And one of those is because every nation has its own experience with colonization. So the influence in that experience is going to be different. So we know that like from Britain, that kind of goes east to west. We have Spain coming south to north, and everything kind of converges in the west. So an interesting thing about Massachusetts, or just New England in general, which isn't actually interesting, I think it's kind of sad, is that Wampanoag people and just New England tribes in general often get left out of conversations, not just on the local level, but the national level, because we no longer have the numbers of the Southwest tribes or the Pacific Northwest tribes. And a lot of that has to do with where contact happened, at what point in time, and when. So if folks landed on the East Coast and we're moving west, people that were more wet on the west coast of the country, they had more time to prepare for war, sickness, just how they were going to respond to what was happening in the landscape. And then of course, like the country in which colonies were established is important as well. So then we also have the impacts of climate change on Indigenous peoples and communities, which is another reason why folks are starting to realize like, hey, we need to have representation at the table or when we're making these decisions, because not only does it affect them, or not only do they know they have a very specialized knowledge of a place, but it impacts them as well. And there are real public health implications and consequences for what's happening. So one example is, I always love the example of salmon, because salmon are one type of fish that always like comes back to where it was born, like geographically. And so when we talk about different tribal nations and their relationship to land, and we start talking about territories and geopolitical borders, it's really important to keep in mind that territories and borders as they exist now are not traditional, because if you were a tribe or a community that was based on your food source, which was a lot of them, you would migrate with the food source, right? So specifically like in the Pacific Northwest, where the salmon runs happen, salmon aren't like, oh, let me get my visa because I'm going to Canada soon. They're just like, no, this is just where we migrate. This is just where we go. But then you have stewards of the land and the water on the Pacific Northwest coast, that now you have Indigenous people, you have sovereign people that traditionally would travel up between, Washington and Canada, but now can't because they don't have a passport. or even if they have a passport, they don't have the same fishing rights as they do in the US or vice versa. And that is inherently a problem in itself. But then specifically when you start talking about climate change and how it affects the fish and the migration patterns, that matters too. So you have the fish that are moving differently now in response to climate change, and it's forcing indigenous communities that have been stewards, and they know the rivers, they know the ocean, they know the salmon, and they have like their creation stories usually based more on the salmon as part of that story. But now they're limited to how they can migrate and follow the fish, but also the source of it, also the pollution, the quality of the fish. And they take their responsibility to heart, as, you know, don't direct quote me, because this is not my tribal story. But I believe the story goes that the salmon had sacrificed themselves for the indigenous community, for the tribes out there. And so in return, like, they promised to always take care of them. And that's why you see a lot of advocacy over there around those things. So this diagram summarizes some of the ways the changes in snowpack distribution and abundance of expected snow in Southwest Alaska likely will influence stream habitat quality and quantity experienced by Pacific salmon, as well as some of the subsequent physiological, behavioral, or ecological impacts expected on various phases of the salmon life cycle. And so it matters. And so, of course, like, when we talk a lot about traditional practices or beliefs, we think that there's a hesitancy to adopt technology, but a lot of folks recognize that, like, hey, it's great that you can now track salmon runs and migration patterns with technology, but how does this complement what we already know? Because we've been here for 4,000 years. We've had this observation of how the land has changed, how the water has changed, how we have had to change in response to that. So it doesn't always have to be a head-on-head thing, but we're trying to work towards how is this complementary versus indigenous knowledge being supplemental, if that makes sense. Another example that I wanted to put is with the bison and buffalo. Another climate change impact that a lot of people don't really think of, or I wouldn't be surprised if you haven't thought about how this affects folks in the plains area. But as the climate warms, bison in North America are likely to shrink. And this has been published in research by Joseph Crane. And the reason why the buffalo in size are shrinking is because as grasslands warm, grasses and other plants accumulate less protein, and then bison are then forced to eat plants that are less nutritious, the outcome being smaller bison. And so part of the climate response to this has been managing plant species that are higher in protein and preferred by bison to ensure healthy herds. But what's missing here is the indigenous perspective and the significance of bison to the land. So then again, here's another example of like, oh, okay, Earth is warming, it's affecting the grass, it's affecting the bison. But what does the bison mean to the people that have been stewarding and been, you know, taking care of the bison for thousands of years? And so on the left, we see all of the different uses of bison, and this doesn't even include the spiritual and the cultural significance of this animal. And I think it's just interesting, like the extractive kind of framing of this climate issue with the lack of kind of like indigenous perspective or context and what that has to offer and to be in addition to. And then on the right, we just see dwindling buffalo herds in the 19th century. And climate health and indigenous public health are very much intertwined. So what's really interesting in kind of the climate space is that you have folks that are caring about indigenous health separate from land, separate from food, separate from animals, or you have this perspective that it's like animal first outside of the context of where it lives and who was usually either interacting or relating to this animal. So it's just like very, very interesting all around. But those are just a few examples that I wanted to share. So indigenous and local knowledge can contribute greatly to ecological assessments. So they can enrich understandings of nature and its contributions to people, more like a holistic view, assess and monitor ecosystem change, shape international targets and global scenarios, and inform inclusive and policy relevant options for people and nature. So again, the shift that we want to see is that indigenous knowledge being more foundational rather than supplemental. And the benefits of that extend far beyond just the land. It's very much holistic. So what is knowledge, and what does it mean to know something or someone? So the first question that I had asked was, who or what is the earth to you? And for indigenous people, earth is mother. And so we have to ask the question is, what does it mean to know something or to know someone? And so the example that I usually use is, how would you prove to me that your sister is your sister or your sibling is your sibling, right? You wouldn't, most likely, you would, to prove to me that, or to show how much you know your sibling, you would tell me about memories that you've shared, milestones. If you're the older sibling, you would tell me, I remember when they took their first steps. I remember that time they did that really embarrassing thing. You would tell me about their personality, their characteristics, what makes them shy, what makes them really happy, if they have any allergies. Most likely you wouldn't show me a family tree and a birth certificate. And for some reason, that's what we do to indigenous people and tribes. We say, validate your knowledge by a piece of paper that has been determined by governments. Which, not to say it doesn't have its place, but that isn't the end all be all, because how you know something is to be in relation to it. The same way is to say, if you ask somebody in my community, how do you know Ryan? It's not to say that everybody in my community knows me, but they most likely know who a Monteiro is, who a Martin is, who your family clan, like you can relate it to something. And that's really no different when we start talking about land and surroundings. So traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, has really come up in popularity. It's kind of like a new buzzword, and I'm sure that there are varying understandings of it. So just the three main sources of TEK is traditional knowledge, which is passed from generation to generation. Traditionally, that's usually oral. Empirical knowledge, which is gained through observation. And then revealed knowledge, which is acquired spiritually and is regarded as a gift. So when we talk about dreams, visions, things of that sort, that's not really valued in Western society, and certainly not in academia at this point, but it is very highly regarded in indigenous culture. So we see here on the right just kind of a chart of indigenous knowledge and modern science knowledge. So we have the oral versus the written, forecast methods being rarely documented versus forecast models and methods being documented. applied at a local level, or indigenous knowledge being applied at a local level versus modern science knowledge lacking relevance at the local level. Indigenous knowledge being language-based and qualitative versus being numbers-based. You can just see kind of the contrast between the two. And like I said, even though I just phrased it that way, when I use the word versus, we want it to be supplemental because everything has a role, and saying like nothing goes to waste, right? So it just takes a little bit to make that mind switch. Okay, hopefully I still have people engaged. I've been talking a lot, but we're almost there. So a major question that I always get is, what can me or my organization or department do? And the answer is probably not what you want to hear at first, but it doesn't make it any less true. So step number one is reflect on the reasons why you want to involve Indigenous partners. I know that there's a lot of planning folks on the call, or just people representing different town or state departments. And it's important to do the internal work, because trust me, when it is a DEI checkbox, it is very apparent. And so to have like a true reflection with you or your team, your organization, and being like, why do we want to involve Indigenous partners on this? What value are we seeking? So on and so forth. That's really important. And then the second one is to examine your relationship to power. And this is where a lot of people misstep. So actually, let me just show the chart. It'll be a lot easier. So depending on the tribal community that you're working with, there's going to be different relationships to different governments. So tribal nations are recognized sovereigns. And the US Constitution recognizes 4 sovereigns: federal government, foreign government, state government, tribal government. And as you can see, like, tribal governments kind of float around here. It's like we're not fully foreign, but we're also not fully state. So it's an interesting floating piece. So if you're working on a climate project or just any project in general, and you're specifically reaching out to a tribal government and your state agency or a town agency, there's a lot of friction around jurisdiction. Because if you're working with a federally recognized tribe, it's like, well, we answer to federal statutes, and kind of that sense. If you're working with a state recognized tribe and you're a local government, it's just really tricky and really hairy, and I totally don't fully understand it. But there's just those nuances. It's really important to at least be aware of them, because an Indigenous partner, specifically a government, they may want to work with you, but some of the reasons why they may not is because, one, of like capacity, 2, misaligned interests, or 3, it's coming down to a jurisdiction thing. And so sometimes we're asking tribal communities to agree to something, and even if they're like, yes, we agree that would be a really great course of action, by doing that would undermine the sovereignty of the tribal government. And so that's where some of these things gets tricky. And that's why I say it's a really important step to recognize and examine your relationship to power. And how I conceptualize power is kind of in 3 ways. You either have power over, power with, or power to something. And these 3 dimensions of power are going to come up in different ways. So something that I always ask organizations before you even reach out to anybody is, okay, you've identified something that you want to work on. What do you have the power to do? Who do you have the power to share it with? And yeah, that's essentially what it comes down to. And then, like, how does power show up in organizational decisions, right? Because if you say, okay, this is my organization, this is what we have the power to do, doesn't mean you have power over a tribe or a community to do such a thing. So by checking that relationship, you have to understand, like, okay, this is power in our area and this is power in their area. How do those things align? Can those things relate? Can we find a way forward? Because a common misstep is just kind of like bulldozing your way and being like, hey, this is what we're going to do. Do you agree to these terms? And if not, too bad. And then that's terrible partnership practices in general. So there's just a note on power. And then step 3 is clearly identifying what you want to ask and what you would like to offer potential partners. And I feel like these steps aren't exclusive to just Indigenous communities, but they're just good partnership practices in general. A lot of Indigenous people get requests all the time to do things or to be a part of things. And by kind of going through these 3 steps, you're taking the emotional labor off of the person that you're asking and laying it out and being forthright, and clearly identifying it. Sometimes, and I'll just speak frankly, sometimes people just want access to you to know that they have you in the back pocket, right? I know that I can call Ryan. I know that I can text Ryan, or we tokenize partners because we don't know a lot of Indigenous people, or we don't have a relationship to Indigenous communities or tribal governments. So I can just speak from my experience. Kind of the emotional labor that I go through is partnerships are going to be a reflection of me. Actually, let me back up and I will say this. Legacy in Western society is very different in Indigenous communities. In Western society, you are basically known for the wealth you accumulate, the power that you acquire or you take, and social status. In Indigenous communities, you will pretty much be known by if you threaten sovereignty or you helped enhance it. And so that is the filter in which I have to filter requests, partnerships, making connections, because if down the road, like I introduce or I give access to something that ends up threatening the sovereignty of my people, it doesn't matter all the good I've done, like that is going to be the mark. So by clearly identifying what you want to ask and what you would like to offer, take some of that burden off. All right. And then just a few things to keep in mind of what matters to Indigenous tribes and peoples. And I say this, I always say tribes, peoples, and communities. And I usually say those 3 things because not every Indigenous person, there is a lot of dispossession of land and displacement of community. So not every Indigenous person is tied to a tribe. And then there are a lot of Indigenous communities that are not recognized either by state or federal governments, but are recognized by fellow Indigenous communities. So that's why I just always say that. But anyways, maintaining and enhancing their religion, culture, and language, first and foremost, maintaining and protecting their political autonomy and sovereign rights, and the welfare of their people and their lands. That is kind of like the 3 main buckets of governments, specifically, what they're tasked to do, what the community expects them to uphold. And that's part of the litmus test of like what moves forward, and how that moves forward. So a question that you could ask yourself is, does my proposed collaboration with this person or community enhance these priorities or threatens them? If it threatens them, either you might have to change the approach, or you have to fully go back to the drawing board. And then just some ideas, just for like building relationships in general, is collaborate with Indigenous creators, designers, researchers, and educators. And please do it, not just in the month of November for Native American Heritage Month. We are Indigenous 12 months out of the year, and our knowledge is very valuable outside of that month. Pay them for their expertise, knowledge, and contributions. A lot of people, going back to the theme of being reciprocal, a lot of people will ask a lot of things of Indigenous people without giving anything back, and that doesn't always have to be money, but just something. And so giving back in some way, shape, or form, and this is something that you could either kind of do on your own, but best case scenario, you would do it in conversation and collaboration with folks that you want to partner with. So in the past, I've been like, hey, thank you for offering this honorarium, and I've had it just routed to an Indigenous nonprofit or an organization, you know, or hey, if you could donate on my behalf to this scholarship fund, you know, things of that. It's like you can be creative in these types of things. And then just some key takeaways and wrap up. So everybody has the opportunity to connect, educate, and engage. Do your research before reaching out. Familiarize yourself with the tribe and their history, their unique strengths and challenges. Some of those really important things are going to be, are you reaching out to a federally recognized tribe, a state recognized tribe? If they don't have recognition, kind of what's the history behind that? Remember reciprocity. There's a long history of extractive practices from US governments and non-indigenous entities in general. And relationships are based on trust. It takes time and it takes genuine connection. And so that's all I have for today. Katabatanamu for joining, which means thank you. If you have any questions or just want to connect, please feel free to reach out to me. And there's my email.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ryan. That was an amazing talk. So if people again have questions, you can put it in the chat. Again, we're not going to get to all of them. We only have a few moments left, but some of the questions that we had